Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's lecture of academic reflections on liberal arts and sciences topics, abbreviated ARLAST, which sounds a little bit like a piece of IKEA furniture. Today, here's an overview of what we're going to talk about. A brief introduction. We'll talk about the distinction between good and bad, good and evil, reevaluating values, and skepticism. Now that sounds a little bit abstract, perhaps, if you look at it at first, but bear with me and we'll make this much more concrete, especially in the context of last Wednesday's class. The framework for today, the book that we're using to look at these various issues, is another work by Friedrich Nietzsche. You'll recall that last week we looked at a few passages from Nietzsche's work. Those were from The Gay Science. Today we look at On the Genealogy of Morals, a Polemic. Now, you may have encountered that word before, genealogy. Here, in this context, it means that we want to look at the origin of values, and in particular, moral values, conceptions like good, evil, and bad. How did they come about? What is their history? Now, the reason we want to look at these concepts is that on Wednesday we saw passages such as this one. You'll recall from the slide shown to you by Professor Hirschbalin from the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, texts like these. Conscious of its spiritual and moral heritage, the Union is founded on the indivisible, universal values of human dignity, freedom, equality, and solidarity. It is based on the principles of democracy and the rule of law. It places the individual at the heart of its activities by establishing the citizenship of the Union and by creating an area of freedom, security, and justice. Now, taking a closer look at this passage, we see terms like universal values and justice. And we want to ask questions about their origin. How do we know there is such a thing as a universal value, let alone several of them? And what is justice? Casting your mind back at last week's lecture, you remember that if God is dead, like Nietzsche rather dramatically proclaims, we have cause to ask questions like, how do we know which values are or should be universal? And how do we know what is just? Again, recapping last week's lecture, what we talked about there is that if an absolute source of value disappears, right? If in fact we stop believing in God or any other entity that confirms to us that what we believe in is absolutely true, if that source of value drops away because of secularization or any other reasons you might want to put there, if that source disappears, then these questions become very difficult to answer. Whereas in the past, it was perhaps easy to say, look, we know these values are universal because it says so in the Bible or some other religious text. How do we know what is just? Well, because again, the Bible says so, or these authorities, church authorities, for example, tell us what is just. If all that falls away, we have this terrifying freedom to make up our own values and to recognize that they are, after all, subjective. So again, looking at that quote, if we talk about universal values, how is it that we can talk about those anyway, especially in this day and age, right? And specifying those universal values, human dignity, etc. How do we know how to think about them, how to apply them? So again, universal values here specified as human dignity, freedom, equality, and solidarity, we might say, come on, everyone agrees that these are good things. You're not going to argue with me that human dignity is not a good thing, right? Freedom, equality, solidarity, we all agree. So their universality springs simply from our agreement. No one's going to argue with you. This is why we want to turn to Friedrich Nietzsche, because he'll say, like, okay, fine, we all agree, but how did these words get their current meaning? And very importantly, how should we interpret them? How do they apply to any given situation? I already mentioned that word genealogy, and that you might have encountered it before. The context in which you might have seen it might be that you have a family member, or perhaps you yourself are interested in the genealogy of your family, which means that you are tracing the family tree back in history, back through the generations to see where you all came from, who your forefathers are, etc. Now, in a case of a genealogy of morals, we're also tracing a historical path, but very importantly, in Nietzsche's case, this genealogy isn't actually hindered by hard historic facts. Nietzsche has a very thorough understanding of history, but definitely plays fast and loose with history as we commonly encounter it in history books. So even though he claims to write up a history of morals, we should read it almost more as a parable, almost more as a story that he's telling us to make a point. This is why he calls it a polemic, in German eine Streitschrift. This is meant to cause trouble. This book is meant to be like a rock that you throw in the water. It's meant to cause waves. So his parable, his genealogy, is meant to shock us out of complacency. It's meant to make us think differently about things that we have been taken for granted. With that in mind, we can look at Nietzsche's favorite topics. He will often refer to the ancient Greeks as a particular fondness for the Greek god Dionysus. Here you see Dionysus being born from Zeus's leg, which is an unusual way of birthing. But not only the ancient Greeks are among Nietzsche's favorite, he also likes polar bears, lions, talks a lot about herd animals, particularly sheep, compares modern man to maggots and thinks that the current state of humanity has a bad smell about it. And he's particularly fond of Vikings. Now, again, encountering all these different creatures throughout his book, we're not meant to actually believe him when he makes claims about the psychology of these individuals or the morality of these different groups of people and animals. No, all of it is woven together to tell us a story about how we might look at morality differently.